Mafia boss showed up at the wedding. A church in Charleston, 300 guests, white flowers, organ music. A bride at the altar with tears running down her face that everyone mistook for joy. The groom reached for her hand, the same hand he'd dislocated 6 months ago. She flinched. The priest opened his mouth to speak. Then the church doors opened, not gently, with the kind of authority that made 300 people turn simultaneously. The man in the doorway wasn't invited. He walked down the aisle like he owned the ground beneath it, stopped 3 feet from the groom, and said 5 words that drained the blood from every face in the room. She's not marrying you today. A bride is standing at the altar with the man who broke her bones, and the most dangerous man. Subscribe and stay, because what happens in this church is about to destroy one of the most powerful families in the South. 3 weeks earlier, Sable Alden had been living the smallest, quietest, most precious life she'd ever known. A studio apartment above a laundromat on King Street, a bookkeeping job at a small restaurant group, a second-hand couch she'd bought with her own money, groceries she chose herself, a door with a lock only she had the key to. It wasn't much by anyone else's measurement. By hers, it was everything. Because 14 months before that, she'd been living inside a nightmare dressed in old Charleston money. Paxton Greer found her when she was 22. She'd aged out of foster care at 18, with a GED and the understanding that nobody was coming to save her. Worked her way through community college, got a bookkeeping certificate, landed the restaurant job, built something from nothing with hands that had never been handed anything. Paxton swept in the way wealthy men swept women who'd never been chosen, relentlessly, overwhelmingly, until the attention felt like oxygen, and she forgot how she'd breathed without it. Handsome. Old money. The Greer family owned half the commercial real estate in the historic district and had a wing named after them at the university. Paxton made Sable feel like she'd been selected from a world that had always overlooked her and placed somewhere she finally mattered. The first hit came 8 months in. The apology arrived with a diamond bracelet and tears so convincing she questioned her own memory. By the end of the first year, she'd quit her job because Paxton said the stress was unhealthy, moved into the Greer estate because he said her apartment wasn't safe, and lost every connection she'd made because Paxton said they were negative influences. The walls closed so gradually she didn't feel them seal until every exit was gone. She left 14 months ago, packed one bag while he was at a dinner, walked out, took a bus to a women's shelter, started from zero again, found the studio, found the restaurant job, started breathing. Then 3 weeks ago, Judge Aldrich Greer knocked on her door. Not Paxton, his father. The patriarch who controlled Charleston's judicial system the way surgeons controlled operating rooms, with precision, patience, and the certainty that everything on the table existed to serve his hands. He made it simple. The Greer family trust required Paxton to be married by 30, 3 weeks away, or the estate's assets would transfer to a board the judge couldn't control. Paxton needed a wife. The judge had chosen Sable. She refused. The judge smiled. He had fabricated embezzlement records planted inside the restaurant group's financial system, evidence manufactured so carefully no audit would question it. If she refused, she'd be arrested. Foster kid, no family, no connections. She'd be convicted before the trial started. The judge would make sure of it, but that wasn't the worst of it. The judge knew about Odessa, a former housekeeper at the Greer estate who'd fled after witnessing things inside the family she was never supposed to see. Sable had been sending Odessa money, $200 a month scraped from a salary that barely covered rent. If Sable refused the marriage, the judge would find Odessa. And Odessa would disappear the way inconvenient people disappeared in Judge Greer's world. Sable agreed. Not for herself, for Odessa. The restaurant group where Sable had been working for 6 months was called Marchetti Holdings. She thought it was a small family operation. It was, but the family was the Marchetti crime family, and the man who owned it was Renzo Marchetti. Charleston-based, 37, the quiet architect of an organization that controlled the Southeast's import corridor. The kind of man who learned everything about everyone in his orbit without them knowing they'd been studied. Sable had been doing his books. Precise. Honest. She didn't ask questions about line items that didn't add up. Renzo noticed her the way he noticed everything. Carefully, from a distance, without revealing he was paying attention. 6 months of professional interaction. But she'd noticed things about him that didn't fit the image. The way he spoke to kitchen staff by name. Cash bonuses left anonymously for the cleaning crew. The evening he found her working late, and instead of asking why she was still there, sat down and asked if she'd eaten. She said yes. He said she was lying. Ordered her dinner. Sat with her while she ate. Didn't check his phone once. She thought about that night for weeks afterward, and never told anyone. Renzo didn't know she was being forced into a marriage. Didn't know the man she was marrying had broken her bones for 2 years. Didn't know that Judge Greer, whose sealed court records Renzo's people had been trying to access for 2 years because the judge was protecting a rival operation cutting into Marchetti territory, was using a bookkeeper as a pawn in a succession play. He didn't know any of it. Yet. 3 weeks passed. Sable moved into the Greer estate like a woman walking into her own coffin. Paxton's welcome home left bruises beneath her collarbone that the wedding dress would cover perfectly. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped being the woman who'd rebuilt herself from nothing and became the ghost she'd been before she escaped the first time. The morning of the wedding, she stood in the bridal suite staring at her reflection. White dress she didn't choose, veil she didn't want, bruises beneath silk. A woman being buried alive in lace and tradition. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. 2 words on the screen. Don't say I do. She stared at the message. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The bridal coordinator knocked. It's time, dear. Sable walked toward the door with the phone pressed against her palm inside the bouquet, and 2 words burning through her skin. She didn't know who sent them. Didn't know what they meant. But something cracked open in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the memory of what hope used to feel like before Paxton Greer taught her to stop reaching for it. She walked toward the altar, and somewhere behind her the church doors were about to open. 2 weeks before the wedding, Renzo Marchetti noticed the absence before anyone told him about it. Sable's desk was empty on a Tuesday morning. Her files were organized. She always left them organized. But the woman who hadn't missed a single shift in 6 months was gone. No resignation, no phone call, no explanation. By Wednesday, he'd made a call. By Thursday, his people had the answer. Sable Alden had moved into the Greer estate. A society page announcement confirmed it. Paxton Greer and Sable Alden, wedding in 3 weeks. The photograph showed Sable smiling beside a man whose arm was draped around her shoulders with the casual possessiveness of someone displaying property, not holding a partner. Renzo read the announcement twice. A woman living independently in a studio apartment she'd fought to afford doesn't suddenly move into a family estate and agree to marry a man whose name she'd never once mentioned in 6 months of working 10 feet from Renzo's office. He didn't believe in sudden love. He believed in leverage. His people pulled the thread and the whole fabric came apart. First, fabricated embezzlement records buried inside Marchetti Holdings' own financial system. Renzo's forensic accountant confirmed they were impossible based on Sable's actual access permissions. Someone had manufactured evidence and planted it where it would detonate on command. The trail led to a consulting firm retained exclusively by Judge Aldrich Greer. Second, Odessa. The former Greer housekeeper living under a different name in a coastal town in North Carolina. Sable had been sending her $200 a month from a salary that couldn't cover her own groceries. Renzo's people made contact carefully. Odessa was terrified, but she talked, because 2 years of hiding had taught her that silence wasn't safety. It was just a slower way of disappearing. What Odessa described rewrote everything Renzo thought he understood about the Greer family. She'd worked inside the estate for 3 years. Witnessed Paxton's violence firsthand. The escalation from shoving to striking, to the kind of calculated damage that stays hidden beneath expensive clothing. She'd seen the medical records altered by a physician on the Greer payroll, watched the family's attorneys manufacture narratives that turned every incident into Sable's instability, rather than Paxton's brutality. But the abuse wasn't the most dangerous thing Odessa had seen. She'd witnessed Judge Greer's private meetings with a man named Victor Laska, the head of a trafficking operation that moved human cargo through Charleston's port under protection of the judge's sealed court orders. The judge wasn't just corrupt. He was the legal architecture shielding the worst kind of crime in the Southeast. Every sealed order, every buried case, every dismissed charge, Laska's operation flowed through Judge Greer's courtroom like water through a pipe he'd built specifically for the purpose. Odessa fled when she realized what she'd stumbled into. Sable helped her vanish. And now the judge was using Odessa as a chain to drag Sable back into the family. Marry my son, or the woman you've been protecting dies. Renzo sat with the information in his study for a long time. The woman who'd been doing his books, careful, underpaid, honest in a way that made dishonest men uncomfortable, was walking into a forced marriage to protect someone she loved from a family that trafficked human beings under judicial seal. He pulled her employee file, read through the work history. The supervisor notes praising her precision and her habit of staying late to triple-check figures already correct. He remembered the evening he'd found her at her desk after hours, the way she'd eaten the dinner he ordered like a woman who'd forgotten that someone could feed her without attaching a price. The way she'd looked at him when he asked about her life outside work and said, "There isn't much," with a smile working so hard to be fine that it cracked something behind his ribs he didn't know was still capable of cracking. He closed the file, made the decision, told himself it was strategic. The judge's sealed records were the key to dismantling Laska's operation and reclaiming Marchetti territory. Told himself Sable was an asset connected to a target. Told himself the tight feeling in his chest when he looked at her photograph in the employee file was professional concern and nothing more. He was lying. He knew he was lying. He made the decision anyway. His people moved. Odessa was relocated to a secure safe house with round-the-clock protection. Then they built the case. Every sealed court order connecting Judge Greer to Laska. Every altered medical record covering Paxton's abuse. Every fabricated financial document designed to frame Sable. The trafficking routes. The port schedules. The money trail linking Laska's payments to a trust account the judge controlled through 3 layers of shell companies. Compiled. Verified. Loaded onto a drive that would be ready in exactly 3 weeks. Renzo also found the other women. 3 before Sable. Same pattern. Isolated, controlled, destroyed. The first had fled to Virginia and refused to speak about the Greer name. The second had been committed to a psychiatric facility on testimony from Paxton and his father. She'd been locked inside for 3 years. The third woman's missing persons case was still open, filed by the DA's office where Paxton's fraternity brother handled cold cases that the Greer family needed to stay cold. The pattern was systematic. Paxton didn't just abuse women. He consumed them, used them, broke them, and when they became inconvenient, the family's machinery erased them. Sable was next on the assembly line. The wedding was the mechanism. 2 days before the ceremony, Renzo sent the text from a burner. 2 words. "Don't say I do." He didn't sign it, didn't explain. He needed her to hesitate at that altar, just long enough. A pause measured in heartbeats, enough time for him to reach the church and do what he'd spent 3 weeks preparing to do. The morning of the wedding, Renzo dressed in silence. Dark suit, no tie. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man about to walk into a church and dismantle a family that had been untouchable for 5 generations. Not with guns, not with threats, with the truth they'd spent decades burying. Kalo, his head of security, a man whose presence alone had ended negotiations before they started, waited at the car. 300 guests, Kalo reported. 12 Greer security, armed. Judges in the front pew. Laska is not present. He's at the port. The drive? Queued. One call sends it to the FBI, the Post and Courier, and every member of the State Judicial Review Board simultaneously. Renzo buttoned his jacket. Let's go to a wedding. The drive to the church took 11 minutes. Renzo spent them in silence, not rehearsing, not strategizing, thinking about a woman eating dinner at her desk 6 months ago. The way she'd held the fork like she wasn't sure she deserved the meal. The way she'd said, "There isn't much," about her life, and meant it so completely that it landed in his chest like something that would never fully leave. The car stopped. The church rose white against a Carolina blue sky. Organ music bled through the walls. 300 people inside watching a woman be buried alive in silk. Renzo stepped out, straightened his cuffs, and walked toward the doors. The doors opened, and 300 heads turned simultaneously. The organ faltered. The priest stopped mid-sentence, and Renzo Marchetti walked down the aisle of St. Michael's Church with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once in his life entered a room without owning it before he reached the center. 2 of his men flanked the entrance. Kalo sealed the doors behind them, not locked, just occupied by a man whose shoulders spanned the doorframe and whose expression communicated that leaving was no longer a casual option. Renzo stopped 3 feet from the altar. He didn't look at the priest, didn't look at the 300 guests frozen in their pews. He looked directly at Paxton Greer, standing in a custom tuxedo with his hand extended toward a bride whose fingers were trembling so hard the bouquet was shedding petals onto the marble. "She's not marrying you today." Paxton's face cycled through confusion and recognition before his breathing kicked in and replastered the charm. "This is a private ceremony. I don't know what you think You know exactly who I am, Greer." Renzo's voice didn't rise. It lowered. The room contracted around it. "And every person in this church is about to know exactly who you are." Judge Aldrich Greer stood from the front pew. 70 years of judicial authority compressed into a single expression of controlled fury. Silver hair, perfect posture. The kind of man who'd spent 4 decades turning courtrooms into instruments of personal power. "Mr. Marchetti, you're interrupting a family occasion. I'd strongly advise you to leave before this becomes a legal matter." "Legal?" Renzo repeated the word like he was turning over something rotten. "You want to talk about legal, Judge? Let's talk about legal." He turned to Sable for the first time. She stood frozen at the altar, tears still wet, veil still in place, the phone hidden inside her bouquet pressing against her palm. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her. His voice changed, lower, softer, stripped of the authority he wielded against men like the Greers, meant only for her. "You don't have to do this. Odessa is safe. She's been safe for 72 hours. Nobody can touch her." The words hit Sable like a defibrillator. Odessa. Safe. The single thread holding her to this altar, the thread against the woman she'd spent 14 months protecting with money she couldn't afford. Severed in 5 words spoken by a man she'd last seen sitting across from her at a desk while she ate dinner she hadn't asked for. "You're lying," Paxton hissed. His composure was cracking. Not the polished fractures of a man adjusting strategy, but the jagged breaks of a man watching control slip through his fingers. Your father's leverage died 3 days ago, along with every sealed court order protecting Victor Laska's operation through Charleston's port." The name Laska detonated through the church like a silent bomb. Judge Greer's face went white. Not embarrassed white. The white of a man watching the scaffolding of his entire life buckle beneath him. 300 guests didn't recognize the name, but the 12 people in this room who did, attorneys, business associates, political allies, stopped breathing simultaneously. Renzo turned to address the church, his voice carried to the last pew without effort. 3 weeks ago, this woman was given a choice by Judge Greer. Marry the man who broke her bones for 2 years, or watch the people she loves be destroyed by a family that has spent decades using the justice system as a personal weapon. He looked at Paxton. "You manufactured embezzlement evidence to trap her. You used a federal judge to threaten a witness into silence. You've been beating this woman since she was 22. And when she finally escaped you, Your family dragged her back to this altar by threatening to kill the only person she was willing to sacrifice herself for. Paxton lunged. His fist swung toward Renzo's jaw, the instinct of a man whose only response to losing control was violence. Renzo caught the fist midair, held it. The same hand that had dislocated Sable's fingers, fractured her ribs, slammed her head into a bathroom counter, wrapped now in Renzo's grip like a bird caught in a steel trap. "Not here," Renzo said quietly. "Not in front of her. You don't get to perform violence in a church and call it honor." He released. Paxton stumbled backward, cradling his hand. Sable moved. She stepped away from the altar. The veil fell from her hair and pooled on the marble like something she'd been shedding rather than losing. She didn't run, didn't collapse. She walked toward Renzo with the deliberate steadiness of a woman choosing her own direction for the first time in years. "The drive," she said. Her voice was quiet, but every person in the first 3 rows heard it. "You have everything?" "Everything. Sealed orders, trafficking documentation, altered medical records. Every document connecting the Greer family to Laska's operation." Sable turned to Judge Greer, the man who'd sat in her apartment 3 weeks ago and smiled while dismantling her life. The man who'd told her that nobody would believe a foster kid with no family over a name like Greer. "You told me I was nothing," she said. "That nobody would listen. That I should be grateful your son wanted me at all." Her voice didn't waver. "Let's see if 300 witnesses in a federal investigation agree with you." She looked at Renzo, nodded once. Renzo pulled out his phone. 1 call, 2 words. "Send it." Within seconds, every phone in the church began vibrating, then buzzing, then lighting up. The drive's contents, released simultaneously to the FBI, the Charleston Post and Courier, 3 national news outlets, and every member of the State Judicial Review Board. Sealed court orders bearing Judge Greer's signature protecting a trafficking network. Fabricated embezzlement evidence designed to frame a woman into a forced marriage. Medical records showing 2 years of domestic abuse systematically erased by a physician on the Greer payroll. Trafficking routes. Financial documentation. Laska's payments traced through shell companies to a trust the judge controlled. The church erupted. Not with noise at first, with the silence of 300 people reading the same evidence on their screens and understanding simultaneously that the family they'd been celebrating had been running a criminal enterprise behind the altar they were standing at. Then the noise came. Phones pressed to ears, guests standing, cameras rising. The society photographer hired to capture the wedding, now capturing its destruction. Judge Greer reached for his own phone and found his signature on documents that would end his career, his freedom, and his family's century-old grip on Charleston staring back at him from his own screen. Paxton stood at the altar, alone, in a tuxedo chosen for a wedding that had just become a crime scene. His mouth opened and closed, but the golden tongue that had charmed courtrooms and convinced emergency rooms was producing nothing. For the first time in his life, the narrative had been written by someone else, and the author was the woman he'd spent 2 years trying to erase. Sable walked back down the aisle, the same aisle she'd been forced to walk up 30 minutes ago, but different now. Every step chosen. The bouquet abandoned on the altar, the veil on the floor, the phone still in her hand. Renzo walked beside her, not guiding, not leading, beside. At the church doors, Sable stopped, turned back one final time. 300 faces staring at her. Paxton frozen at the altar. Judge Greer sinking into the pew like a man whose skeleton had just dissolved. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence, standing upright, walking out, choosing herself, said everything the Greer family had spent 3 weeks trying to silence. The doors closed behind her. Carolina's sunlight hit her face, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she breathed without permission. The FBI moved before the wedding guests reached their cars. 3 separate teams, one to the Greer estate, one to Judge Greer's chambers, one to Victor Laska's port operation. The sealed court orders that had protected Laska's trafficking network for over a decade were now federal evidence. Laska was arrested at a private airfield 4 hours later. passport in hand, duffel bag packed, the panicked eggs in the state, and understood that the judicial shield he'd paid millions for had just been shattered by a bookkeeper in a wedding dress. Judge Greer was removed from the bench before sunset. 40 years of authority dissolved by his own signature on documents he'd never imagined would see daylight. The state bar launched disbarment proceedings. Federal charges followed: conspiracy, obstruction, accessory to trafficking. The Greer family name became the most toxic word in Charleston overnight. 5 generations of curated respectability incinerated by the contents of a single drive released from a church pew. Paxton was arrested at the altar, still in his tuxedo, handcuffs over French cuffs. The charges stacked like bricks: domestic battery, coercion, fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering. His groomsmen backed away before the officers reached him. His mother watched from the front pew with the frozen expression of a woman whose understanding of her own family was collapsing in real time. The society photographer captured every second. The images were on national news before Paxton reached the processing desk. Odessa testified. The woman Sable had protected for 14 months with $200 scraped from a salary that couldn't cover her own rent, sat in front of a federal grand jury and told them everything. The abuse she'd witnessed inside the estate, the medical records altered by the family physician, the meetings between Judge Greer and Laska that she'd stumbled into while cleaning the study, conversations about shipment routes and port schedules discussed over bourbon like logistics instead of lives. Her testimony sealed cases prosecutors had spent years building: 3 federal indictments, 2 state investigations. Victor Laska's entire network, mapped, documented, and dismantled because a housekeeper had the courage to remember what she'd seen, and a bookkeeper had the stubbornness to keep her hidden long enough for the truth to matter. The women before Sable were found. The first, living under a different name in Virginia, agreed to make a statement. Her hands shook the entire time, but her voice didn't. The second was released from the psychiatric facility where Paxton and his father had committed her on fabricated testimony. She walked out into sunlight she hadn't seen in 3 years, blinked, cried, called her mother for the first time since the doors had locked behind her. The third woman's case was reopened, months later. Charleston in late autumn, Spanish moss catching golden light, the air carrying salt from the harbor, and the particular stillness of a city learning to breathe around a wound it didn't know it had. Sable stood in front of a converted townhouse on a quiet street in the historic district. White shutters, window boxes planted with lavender, Odessa's idea because she said it reminded people to breathe. The sign above the door read Odessa House, not Sable's name, not Renzo's. Odessa's. Because the first group of women who sheltered there voted on it unanimously. The woman who'd risked everything by remembering what she saw deserved to have her name on the door of the place that existed because she refused to let the truth stay buried. 20 beds, legal aid, job training, financial literacy workshops taught by Sable herself, because a woman who'd had her money weaponized against her understood better than anyone that financial independence wasn't just freedom. It was armor that couldn't be taken in the night. Odessa ran the front desk. She'd moved back to Charleston after the trial, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She greeted every woman who walked through the door with the same 5 words: "Nobody disappears in this house." Sable was different now. The flinching had stopped. The constant scanning of exits, the survival habit Paxton had hardwired into her nervous system, had quieted into something softer. She still checked her locks at night, probably always would. But she did it on her own door, with her own key, in her own home. And that difference contained everything. A Tuesday afternoon, autumn light falling through the townhouse windows in long, amber sheets. Sable was at her desk reviewing intake paperwork when the front door opened and Renzo walked in carrying 2 coffees. No convoy, no entourage. Just a man in a dark jacket who looked like he'd been quietly rearranging the architecture of his entire life around a single decision he'd made in a church. He'd restructured, pulled back from the parts of his operation that required the version of himself he'd grown tired of inhabiting. Still powerful, still respected across every port and territory in the Southeast, but building now instead of controlling. The Marchetti Restaurant Group had expanded. Legitimate holdings, real revenue, clean books. He'd made Sable CFO, not Charity. She was the sharpest forensic mind he'd ever seen with a balance sheet, and he was done pretending that wasn't the reason he'd first noticed her. He set the coffee on her desk. She took it with both hands, the same way she'd held that first cup in his kitchen the morning after she vanished from the restaurant group. Both hands. Like warmth was something she still couldn't quite believe she was allowed to hold. "You know when I knew?" she said. He waited. Not the church, not the aisle, not watching Paxton's face when you walked through those doors. When? "The night you found me working late. You asked if I'd eaten. I lied. You ordered dinner anyway and sat with me while I ate." She looked at him, at his hands wrapped around his own cup, at the jaw that had been tight with fury in a church and was soft now in the afternoon light of a townhouse that smelled like lavender and new paint. "You didn't check your phone, didn't take a call, didn't glance at the time. You just sat there like that moment, like feeding me, was the most important thing on your schedule." Her voice was steady. "Nobody in my entire life had ever treated a moment with me like it was worth protecting. That's when I knew who you were before your last name ever could have told me." Renzo set down his coffee, reached across the desk, took her hand. She didn't pull away. Hadn't wanted to since the moment he'd walked down an aisle she was being forced to stand at the end of, and given her back the life the Greer family had stolen with 5 words and the truth they'd spent decades burying. He kissed her. In a townhouse on a quiet street that smelled like lavender and printer paper and the particular warmth of a place built specifically so no woman would ever be forced into a room she couldn't leave. No church, no altar, no audience. Just 2 people who found each other across a balance sheet and a forced wedding and chose, freely, without leverage, without coercion, without a single hand on their backs, to stay. Across town in a federal holding facility, Paxton Greer sat in a cell wearing orange. The evening news played in the common room. The anchor smiled. "Odessa House celebrated a milestone today. 100 women served in its first 4 months. Founder Sable Alden calls the mission simple. No woman should ever be forced into a room she can't leave." Sable on screen, Renzo beside her. Both smiling the way people smile when they've built something worth standing in front of. A guard lived with the knowledge that the woman he'd tried to own was the woman who owned his destruction. And she'd done it without ever raising her hand the way he'd raised his. If you made it this far, you felt something. And we both. A space where stories remind you that the people the world counts out are usually the ones who change everything. Drop this with someone who needs to hear that no door stays locked forever. We read every single one.